I want to thank you each. And maybe you could just start by telling people who you are and what your immediate research is, and then I will steer us towards a set of questions and ask, you don't have to answer every one, but whoever feels it's pressing, go to it. And it will be informal, and then we want to turn to the audience here, extraordinary number of you, thank you for coming, and engage you in this conversation. Geeta, who are you? Curator, critic, working on.
Critic, curator. First critic, then curator. I'm quite sure of that. One, because I don't curate so often, and two, I would, critical practice is primary for me, and curation is an extension of that, and that really does change the relationship insofar as the paradigms I would set up are within the within the critical field or through criticality, and the curation would be something of a realization through it through a phenomenological exposition. So I'm quite clear about that distinction.
We're going to try and push on both the scholarly and the what goes on in a gallery, which is scholarly but deals with a physical presence of objects, which is a perfect segue for Joanna.
My name is Joanna Mytkowska, and I'm a museum director. Since 10 years, I'm trying to build a museum in Warsaw, so I'm mostly dealing with local politics. I'm curating sometimes, and in the meantime, in these efforts of establishing a museum, together with the great team of the Warsaw Museum of Modern Art, in Polish we are called MSN, we are doing several projects which are dealing both with the historical positions and very urgent contemporary questions.
Hi, my name is Irene Small. I'm an art historian, and I suppose my most immediate area of specialty is Brazilian modernism, experimental practices of the 50s, 60s, 70s. I've worked on Chika, and I'm moving on to a project on Leisha Clark's notion of the organic line. And I guess I would say that my interest in this sort of very particular set of experiments is the way in which they complicate the very notion of modernism. And so I understand Brazilian modernism as not a kind of additive episode within a kind of global art history, but one that actively deforms what we can understand of modernism as such.
Chika?
Chika Okeke-Agulu. I'm an artist and art historian. My research has dealt with modernism in post-colonial Africa in the 50s and 60s, and I have since been working on a project that looks at the new formations, post-70s formations across the continent in the era of what I'm calling the big man, that is this phenomenon of which the dictator is one. And what that also speaks to is my abiding interest in the intersection of art and politics. And I have explored these through exhibitions, but also through art criticism, which is why I blog, and through art historical scholarship.
Thank you for giving me the opening for my first question, which has to do with, we spent a lot of today talking about the 50s and 60s, the optimism in the post-colonial moment. Some of that optimism was wrapped in ideas of nationalism. So to kind of set the backdrop for today, we're living in a moment of Trump, Le Pen, Brexit, anti-immigration, dictatorships returning in Venezuela, Egypt, and Turkey,
In India.
and India. Well,
Not dictatorship,
And
not
Brazil.
dictatorship, but proto-fascism.
okay, I was sensitive about saying that. But you'll see that my colleagues here are actually very capable of speaking for themselves. So what do we think about nationalism today? And is there a word that maybe is less freighted? Or is it a concept that actually has no longer a generative meaning when it comes to the making of art institutions?
Who's going to go?
Well, if I may, I think that nationalism may have become a bad word in the post-war Euro-American context for good reasons, but it wasn't, right, for a vast swath of the world, the decolonizing world. I think that one of the things that one has to pay attention to is that this other term that has been used quite a bit in the past decade or so, which is the post-colonial. It's not an elsewhere, right? The post-colonial is not about the formerly colonized. It's also about the former colonizer, which is why when you see what's talking about and thinking about today, which is why when you see what's happening in Europe and in the United States, there's very question about who are we, right? Which is what's driving much of this politics of the individuals that you mentioned, has everything to do with the recursive phenomenon of post-colonization. The fact that in many of these places they're having to deal with the long-term consequences of what was thought to have passed, right?
And they're not passed, right?
But obviously they are not, because they're having real life impact on how people think of themselves today. And that's precisely why I brought up this question of the existential, right, earlier in the day, that the kind of rhetoric that we hear very much these days, it's about what constitutes existential threat, right, to collective imaginaries, which oftentimes is framed these days around nations, right? We thought that nations had become obsolete, right, because of globalization. But we know now that that was also one of those great myths, right, that the modern threw up, that the nation is still very potent in how people see and think of themselves and imagine themselves as a civilization, as a culture, and just a group of people.
So how do you create a museum of national identity? Because in fact you could say MoMA to some is a museum of a certain more expansive idea of national identity, but Western identity, and maybe properly we're criticized for that. So how do you create a museum of Polish identity?
I was never trying to do that, but I would say that I'm living in Warsaw, in Poland. It's become we have a populist government, and our museum is depending on that government. So dealing with that issue is our everyday experience, and I think that they are at least two important points. One, it's a failure of our fantasy of being an international link with the. Maybe we were not so much dedicated, we were quite dedicated always to our locality, but this fantasy of a certain Western idiom, obviously, it was very effective for our program. So this failure, it's a quite an important starting point. We decided that in these circumstances of this pressure, of this quite aggressive nationalism we have in Poland right now, and of course the society is divided, but nevertheless that's the picture, that our duty as a museum is to examine what are the reasons for that. This is, of course, a difficult guess, and it changed a lot our program. We thought that we have to try to change our language, that we cannot speak with the same idiom. It simply doesn't work anymore. So we are trying to work on that, which is not easy. And the results are pretty surprising. The only thing we could invent in this new situation was the show dedicated to the sign of Warsaw, mermaid, which sounds silly, but we were examining this
The
as
symbol.
the symbol, yeah, the symbol of Warsaw. But we were examining this from the perspective of how symbols are working. And when you are living in a country which become nationalistic, you are constantly dealing with the symbols which are excluding, which are creating boundaries and so on and so on. And a mermaid as a hybrid, it's a relatively easy one and a relatively open one. And then, of course, we could deal with the whole idea of a contemporary culture being mostly different modes of queering, canons, and so on. But this this failure is the first things when we are talking about nationalism. The second, strangely enough, will go to the notion of neocolonialism, and that's very surprising in a country like Poland. We were always far away from global politics, but what's become now appear in the center of a discussion and also affect our museum is this internal colonialism in Poland in the 16th and the 19th century, which was never articulated in culture. Or never articulated in the visual arts. And now it seems that this search for the reasons of this sudden collapse of democratic values, this aggressive nationalism, led us to this deep research into the social condition. And we learn a lot from many projects dealing with neocolonialism, especially the exhibition we mentioned today many times, After Year Zero, which we did together with Annette Busch and Anselm Franke, which was first curated in Hauser der Kultur der Welt in Berlin and then in a museum in Warsaw. So I would say that current politics change a lot our institution, and that is a very dynamic process.
Geeta, so yeah.
I would like to say something. First of all, I want to start where Chika did, that the word national and nationalism does not mean the same for countries that decolonized and entered the post-colonial historical moment and consciousness. And the fact that we are constantly, all these years, for decades since the decolonization process began, have been told that the nation form is not only defunct but that it is evil, it does not work for countries that have actually fought the colonialism on the grounds of a national resurgence. So clearly our discourse has to be different from Western discourse in the 20th century or beginning in the late 19th century, where progressively this term becomes stands for constricted identity, whereas here it was aspirational identity in the countries that were going through the process of decolonization and then developed post-colonial nation states. My book from 2000 is called When Was Modernism? Contemporary Cultural Practice in India. And in that I've used the I've been speaking about it in the morning, and excuse the repetition for those who were there, but the term that I have used consistently for a period of time is national modern hyphenated. Now, this itself, it's both a description of how the nation, the populace, the polity, the leaders, the intellectuals, the artists saw themselves positioned in relationship to both the national resurgence, but in terms of a clear recognition of modernity. So the two have to be hyphenated for our purpose in order to understand what were the tensions and the conflicts that were worked out during the decolonization and the post-colonial period. Now the question is, of course, that we too are facing the worst kind of nationalism, particularly at this moment, not throughout. I must insist that in post-independence India, nationalism, like in the countries that entered the Bandung Agreement and the non-aligned movement, and subsequently the tricontinental movement in Latin America, these were nations that were proud to be nations, and that they were breaking the ground both at the national level of political emancipatory programs, but also making international alliances, as Bandung and non-aligned movement and the tricontinental movement were. So for our histories, this term has both an honorable history and then series of issues that arise from the 60s, like the countries lapse into dictatorships or into military regimes and so on. However, I would like to also propose, which is not always popular, even in the Indian political and social discourse, that it is important to retain at least a critical interest or critical inquiry into the idea of the nation state. One, because it actually exists and you can't wish it away. You can't actually pretend that it is no longer of importance because it is such an evil, it has such evil manifestations. The fact is that it exists, and it exists, as you know too well, in the United States. So the nation state has to be part of the agenda of inquiry and criticality. Number two, and I would follow Indian Marxist historians and political scientists and economists to say that even now, with all the evil that is associated at the moment with Indian nationalism, with the present right-wing fundamentalist and proto-fascist almost government of Narendra Modi and his large backing of the cultural right in India, the fact is that we cannot abandon an engagement with the nation state. And the Marxists in India have maintained that. One, because that is the only form of praxis that is possible to, that the form of praxis that is required for this engagement is the one that has still an emancipatory value. Number two, because with globalization, with economic globalized capitalism, there are only some bulwarks. There's some kinds of vantage points of inquiry and criticality, and the nation state at least allows a space for that. Otherwise, in actual fact, there would be no difference between any globalized country and another. So this would be a vantage point for both critiquing the nature of the nation state itself as well as global capital.
So, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to a question that you posed earlier, because I think in this issue of interrogating the nation state, as we must do at a political level, I think we also have to interrogate the fit and appropriateness and implications of the kind of allegory or metaphor you suggested earlier of MoMA being its own kind of nation state. Because I think that on the one hand, the title of Decentering the Museum suggests a kind of an interest in the transversal and the global that many of us and many of our colleagues working in various parts of the world very much support. However, if we are to understand MoMA as operating MoMA, the Tate, many other metropolitan museums, as operating even against themselves as a kind of entity approximating something like a nation state. How do we really think out the unfolding implications of that? Because although we are working in a scenario in which we have, on the one hand, an economic globalization, on the other hand, this surging right-wing nationalism, a lot of the museums understand an operation like Decentering the Museum as actually operating within a kind of colonial logic of extraction in terms of how collections are compiled, what kinds of work transit from where do they live. You know, and if we push further, is the other version of that some kind of nation building, right? I mean, these are very problematic issues, but I think because the metaphor is there, because we're here at a museum thinking about nationalism, I think we have to push on those as well.
I agree with you, but I also don't know what the alternative is other than to try and steer towards a more porous idea of an institution. I mean, we start, you know, 1929. It's now a long time from there, many cycles of economic prosperity and despair. For some, the despair never went away. But I think for me, CMAP was an attempt not to acquire things other than knowledge, and to expand the experts that we talk to on an ongoing, normal basis, and to not only travel out, but to have people come in so that we could look quite intimately at what we did and learn about those things we didn't understand or know. So it's been about, I think, 7 years, 8 years of research. And the only thing I can say is that the research has really focused for an extended period on various regions. We could have focused on ideas, on people, whatever, but the initial notion was on regions. But let's talk about MoMA. Geeta, you mentioned today a longtime friend of MoMA, Paula Herkenhoff, who was here for several years, as a curator, adjunct, I believe, but and somebody I have learned an incredible amount from. I think it wasn't the easiest place for him to operate. He actually showed in real time, the Ligia Clark and the Frank Stella in 2000, I think, or around 2000. Yeah, 2001. I remember going through the galleries with him and how upset he was that people didn't actually understand what he was trying to do. But he said something I think that's very useful to us. When you cited him talking about the shared approaches of the Brazilians Ligia Clark and Helio Otacika, say from the 60s, with the 1950s Gutai Japanese movement, and with Yoko Ono's Fluxus-inspired work. And you said, I think I'm not sure whether it's your words or his, that what this hints at is an unlikely complementary approach. And posited that maybe that idea, these unlikely complements, was a useful paradigm for all of our futures, but I'm most interested in a way tonight in exploring this institutions. So maybe, I think it came up in almost everybody's talk today as a useful idea. So if there were a gallery at MoMA, what would come before this conjunction of Ligia Clark, Helio Otacika, Gutai, Fluxus, and what would come after it? And inherent in this question is chronology the friend or the enemy?
Well, I don't think that we need to think in terms of, of chronology in those terms, right, friend or enemy. But I think that there's something productive about chronology, because when you think about history, time, then you're thinking about the passage of time. How you map that is the question, right? And it seems to me that the presentation by Louise, right? That
Perez Ormas, or
yes, that
dearly
showed the
departing
Amaral and the Kandinsky. That already pushes
Mondrian.
Mondrian. That already pushes the time frame to the 20s, right? The late 20s. And I'm fairly sure that if we were to also look to the decade before, we'll find artists in various places working out certain questions about the condition of being modern, right? And so I think that what it takes is research, right? This is where I see tremendous value in the CMAP, in the sense that if you don't know what exists, you can't pretend to have an answer, for the world. So I think that in order to think broadly about chronology or networks of sites, both in regional and chronological terms, which is really what we're, the rhizomic, the network, the correlations, the parallels, and so forth, that once we have a sense of what was going on in different parts of the world, it's possible to see patterns. Patterns not because we want to resolve these relationships, but to examine them for what productive knowledge they can produce.
What would some of the patterns be based on?
On the elements that we tend to think in terms of form, in terms of ideas, in terms of discursive questions that are either producing or responding to the work, right? So it's whether we think in terms of what were the artists, what were the tools available to the artists, what were the questions the artists were asking, what were the critical discourses around these works. It's possible to see antagonisms or correspondences or both, right? Which is why I think when the question of the messiness came up earlier, there was a sense by one of the commentators, that this is like, a no-go area.
The question was MoMA able to embrace the messiness of something that wasn't quite smoothed out in the way that traditionally, I would say not Alfred Barr, but William Rubin, told the story of the modern. And, my sense is, for better or worse, most of us, large institutions, are actually quite self-critical. We just don't like to show it. And so for me, what would happen if we actually showed the cracks, the unresolved questions? I mean,
I think that what we're getting into is what happens to an institution that has become successful, right? Or even individuals. What happens to scholars who have developed a certain kind of scholarship, and by the time they are retiring or they get to the height of their careers, the possibility of changing position is something that they look at with great, anxiety. I think that this is part of what's going on, because if you think about the history of this institution, the kinds of risks that it took earlier, in earlier decades, in terms of the kinds of work that it showed, I remember quite clearly, when I was doing my research, they were even showing the work of children from different parts of the world. You can imagine doing that now, right? So I think that this is part of what we're dealing with. It's not as if there is nothing in the DNA of this institution to actually take what now amounts to risk. The possibility of risk gets lower the more successful you become, and he's become successful in what he does.
I actually agree with you, but so what are the risks that are worth taking?
Can I say something little before
Sure.
about chronology?
Yeah.
Chronology is a neutral term, and in actual fact, what is enacted through chronology is not neutral. So why not actually name it? And we say not chronology, but the history of things. But I would use it more actively as historicizing. So if you actually activate the term chronology into historicizing, then there is an agency there, and then there is a convergence of discursive and active possibilities.
Well, it's not science, it's personal.
Yeah, and historicizing has many other reasons to be useful, or rather to be the term to be used, because as I said in the morning also, all historicizing will immediately involve contradictions, whereas chronology is actually not, there's no interest in that. So if we are going to deal with historicizing, then we are dealing with contradictions, and we are dealing with the issues that, say, Chika was proposing. I mentioned just a little before that my one of the books is called When Was Modernism, and it's clearly taken from Raymond Williams, but has another argument which has much more to do with what I've called the national modern. And the when, obviously, is a use of the word to displace the chronology. So already, I mean, when you say when, there is not a chronology which is valorized. And I would, now chronology allows for the insistence on the originary and the derivative. And I would now, and Chika and I were talking about it, we would now quite like to use the word derivative, but add radical to it. So radical derivatives. And if it is question of belatedness, we can accept belatedness, but talk of anachronism. And so I think there are ways of using the very words that go against any kind of genuine interest in the historicizing process across the world by actually changing vocabularies and or accepting vocabularies and annotating them
But they're
differently.
loaded. The language, when you change it very purposefully, has still embedded in it the old explosion. Otherwise, there would be no.
Yeah, but I'm interested in that.
Yeah,
that
I
it
mean,
is
the old
actually
explosion carries with it the structures of power. And I mean, unless we're aware of the structures of power, then we are not able to move forward with the continuing contradictions that they carry as a residue. And I think that that's the kind of key lesson of some of these post-colonial artists that you were talking about earlier, is that say, the rhetoric of nation that Frantz Fanon put forward was a necessary tool, but unless we can move with it and retain it as this kind of residue, then we are wiping out the kind of history. And I think this is why the question of global art is, I think, so crucial, because is global art used as a kind of vitamin infusion for the sick patient, to go back to your earlier analogy, or is the sick patient taken and say, okay, let's actually show, the broken hips?
Yeah, and you ask about risks. So there are two major risks: to clearly explain the position from which you want to represent the rest of the world, and that's obviously the risk. And the other is to have not a coherent message. If you allow the freedom, of curating different exhibition in a sort of not negotiated way. I don't know how that can look in the real life, but those, I guess, are two major risks for the big successful institution.
So one of the things CMAP was also intended to, contemporary and modern art perspectives in a global age is what CMAP stands for. One of the things it acknowledged was the fact that no institution can contain infinite expertise. We depend upon you to work with us, help us, critique us, think about us. But can any institution's collection be genuinely global? And how do you decide where that begins or ends? Go ahead.
No. I mean, earlier you mentioned that your museum collection was necessarily fragmented and had no desire to create a whole. And I think that that is an absolutely important thing to think about in terms of forming something like an articulation of globality in terms of not just collection but practice. And I think here we go back to the whole question of CMAP not being about extracting anything but knowledge. I think knowledge is a big thing to extract. You know, to go back to my own very particular area of specialty, the Museum of Modern Art in Rio was formed on the model of this museum with Nelson Rockefeller as a consultant. And that museum's archive, its education, its entire educational department archive, all of its library is inaccessible because of lack of funds. And so the question of the accessibility, the availability of knowledge, what can be created, how one can listen, and who gets to listen, I think are questions that are very, very important. And so when we think about the models of these museums that have acquired incredible amounts of history and collection and knowledge, I think we also have to, as I mentioned just in that last session, sort of thicken the link that moves between a given location and MoMA, and think about collaborations, think about ways in which knowledge and work can be shared. And there is a kind of administrative messiness that's beyond a kind of phenomenological messiness that you might access by seeing a kind of discrepant juxtaposition you wouldn't expect in a permanent collection. That is about, the fact that certain museums don't have humidity controls and certain museums don't have this and that. That's often used as the kind of logic for not engaging in partnerships. But I think that any true initiative to decenter a museum amongst all of these large museums as they think about the global contemporary as this new kind of field of operations has to think very seriously about that.
I agree with you, which is one of the reasons why we've developed a partnership with Wuch,
Right.
where our collection, we've exchanged curators, so their curators, a couple have come here and spent quite a bit of time thinking about, learning about, looking at our collection, and then requested some loans that actually we acted on in relatively short time and helped make possible to loan, with the understanding that our curators who went there also, there are things that they had the context to acquire that we didn't, that we think would actually change a certain understanding of what might be going on in a gallery. And so we did develop this partnership that came out of really CMAP a building relationship. We went back to places more than once. We worked with their staff traveled with our staff. So I think you're right. How many relationships an institution or a person can have, I'm not sure, but yeah. I think the word is reciprocity, and I think that is an important word.
Yeah, there are at least 4 things that museums do. They exhibit, they acquire, they publish, they teach, right? Among other things that they do. So it's some are less fraught than others, right? When it comes to money, that's a big part. What gets acquired. I think that's really where a lot of debates go inside the museum who gets how much to buy what. But when it comes to what forms of knowledge can be acquired by entering such a museum, that means the exhibit, the publications, the programming that that such a museum can produce and send to both its local audiences and, if possible, other audiences. So I think that a museum, yes, can be global. I mean, global does not mean representing the 201 countries on the planet, right?
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
You know, it's more about the sensibility, right? There was a time, and here one can say in the past tense, there was a time when, maybe still, when the kind of resistance to even a conversation about art from elsewhere was such. I came to graduate school in my second professional life in as an art historian when you could find curators in museums like this and professors in universities in this country, especially in the Northeast, who would look at you in the face and say, no, I don't look at such things, as if it's a badge of honor, right? I think that one of the things that has begun to happen is a sense in which, I think I should probably know this, right? That sensibility is already one of the first steps towards being global.
I mean, I remember I went to Japan in 1985, and
Yeah.
there was a much more senior, much more established, much more visible colleague from another New York museum. And we were looking at a Shiraga. And she turned to me and she said, well, it's just grade C, abstract expressionism. And I sort of looked at her, and I didn't know that much. I just knew there was something there worth looking at more than once. And I said, are you sure? I mean, we're on an island. We're on an island that was bombed with a nuclear weapon. You know, we're on an island that has a different set of philosophical premises, blah, 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 blah. And it really changed my life. Her certainty changed my life. And I think it is simply a matter of, not simply, one of the major tasks, I think, for all of us who work here, is to acknowledge that there are many things we don't know, actually more than what we know. And, who to turn to expand our horizons. But how do universities do this? It's not a different problem.
Well, different universities have different. As you're right, as with museums, there are programs here, elsewhere in Europe and stuff where it's still such a big burden trying to speak to your colleagues about what you do, right? And I think it's probably it's the same thing in museums. When they make the occasional, after a long sigh, to hire someone to to curate or to teach a field that has not been part of the story, and it's like, okay, we've done that. We've hired the African. And the same thing with museums, right? They hire that curator, maybe a lower position, to take care of these other fields. And they live in this kind of no man's land, if you will. But they are working in the museum, right? So at a certain level, we've done that. At another, not really. So I think that happens in universities. That's why you might find programs or university programs that have institutes, right, where there are programming that deal with international, global, art and visual practices.
But that's
and
not
so forth.
bad, is it?
No, I'm not. That's what I'm suggesting is that the difference between an academic program that insists on its Western art historical paradigm and occasional sprinkling of others.
It's hard.
Yes, and others who are rethinking the very premise, right, of art history teaching. And I think the most fraught side of this is in the Art History 101. For those who have attended college in this country, what is the shape of the Art History 101 in any university? That's how you know which ones are actually thinking about the global and which ones are not.
Irene, what's
Well-
101?
Well, we teach at the same place.
I know you do.
We team teach that class.
So this
actually.
is Princeton, just in case you want to know.
We all of the faculty team teach it, which I think is one way of understanding the contingency of a department, and I think a very valid way. We sort of try and teach it through thematics that go through the course as a whole. I guess I would say to my particular disciplinary configuration, I mean, I think that the global contemporary art history is a particularly fraught site of expectations, because there is this idea that is really carried upon the market structure that followed biennalization, that you can do something like the global contemporary.
I want to get back to that. But
Okay.
I want to give, that will be where we'll go next. But Geeta, you wanted to
No, I
respond.
wanted to say, you made a comparison between universities and museums. I'm neither in a university nor in a museum, but it seems to me that the possibility of extending discursive ground in a university is more likely than, if I may say so, in a museum, because the
Sure.
museum has a different kind of capital investment. The acquisitions have a very clear, there's a commodity aspect to the object that is bought and added to the acquisitions collection of the
And the
museum.
audience as well.
Sorry?
And the audience.
And the audience and the persuasion that is required to make the audience receptive to any kind of risk or change. I think that in a university where you have a student population that can be more easily perhaps persuaded to look at a wider range of issues, should be anyway possible. But
Is that true?
no, not true.
Is that true?
Aspirational, maybe.
But certainly a museum as an institution has a kind of capital investment in that object of art, which is very different from how it is discursively placed within larger discourses.
I think
should
that's
imagine
true, but
that's
you should
true.
look at everybody's storage areas. They're full of things that people once thought were.
And there are different models for the museums.
Yeah, that's
the
true.
European public museums, they have a very different attitude toward capital. So I guess they are a bit more free in.
Also because they are
Yeah.
more state-sponsored,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
is the
yeah,
fact.
yeah.
That is why I think that the idea of the state is not something that can be
But I
wiped
like-
out, because the state can play a progressive role, as indeed it
they
has
can,
done.
but
like nation.
yeah, exactly, they can.
No,
But
yes, of course, but capital, but.
Yes. So I have to say this. Yes, I think I have to say this out of my own experience. That for many years, it was only possible to do the kind of exhibitions that we were interested in doing in Europe, not the United
the colonizer.
States. Well, in part because of this question of state funding. Because with state funding, they could take risks more than American institutions.
Yeah.
By which I
State
mean...
is slower than capital, much slower.
It might be, but it's that the pressures that under which museums that have to respond to trustees and endowments and all of that, the kinds of risks that they are willing to take are different from the risks that institutions, at least in Europe, whether it's in Germany or in
Yeah.
France or in the UK, are willing to take when it comes to art from other places. Because this is where where the risk comes. It's a different thing in Matisse, Picasso, and another to do another show on, Australian Aborigines.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. That I will say
Yes.
that it's also true that institutions in Europe don't depend upon admissions as much as American museums. That actually, can you imagine if we were getting funding from Trump? I mean, we
Wow.
don't apply for that,
Mm-hmm.
But, so I'm not sure state funding actually is always such a good thing. I
No,
mean,
but
you
we're talking
experience
about
that.
Kathy,
in
but
terms
state
of the
funding-
question of the global.
State funding allowed for the best European cinema for decades, which is in East Europe. So let's also remember the fact that state funding has had its role.
I don't disagree. I just think it's as fluid a mechanism of control as any other. And I actually, I know that trustees exert power. I mean, I've
they're
worked
mostly
in them for
connectors.
many, many years.
Yeah.
But honestly, this is going to sound really bizarre. I think it's a form of self-censorship that provides the greatest resistance. Our curatorial self-censorship. And part of it is out of a sense of devotion to these things, one grew up with. I never imagined one would be able to embrace professionally, and part of it is this sense of history weighs very heavily.
Yeah, that's not right. That's not a strange comment. It's no different from their colleagues who are scholars teaching in universities
Yeah.
who have published in this realm, and suddenly you expect them to publish in a different field. They're going to resist because naturally they will say, they will, profitably argue that they don't have the tools, right, to deal with a different set of objects or practices and so forth. So I think that might come from that. But of course there are ideological undertones sometimes, perhaps even often, to why the resistance, the self-censorship that you mentioned comes up. They buy into a way of thinking, and which is natural for human beings. So, it's not as if one is trying to suggest that curators are different. They are the
But-
same with scholars who work in
Kathy,
in
if the
professional
moment
fields.
that MoMA or an institution like this can mess with the idea of the avant-garde, I think that will be a very important moment.
Okay, continue.
So,
I think that's a very interesting
We
idea.
talked about it briefly in the afternoon, and I said that I admired and I was completely awestruck by the way Okwe and Vizor was able to make a messy exhibition of post-war, meaning messy in terms of a museum show, museum curation, that he was able to, or they were able to, place, use an entirely different phenomenological experience as well as a template. And he, of course, they were not dealing with the avant-garde in any very, that was not the primary argument there. But I think that the importance of being able to, and we discussed, these presentations today were part of that there is something other than the avant-garde that either Peter Berger proposed or the October Group proposes. And that has been argued for a long time. It's been argued through Brazilian, the Brazilian art movements, through Japan, now through China with total gumption. Chinese artists only use the word avant-garde. They don't use the word modern at all. And they say we are contemporary and we are avant-garde.
The modern kind of escaped them.
They say that what modern? They
Yeah.
say, what is India talking about modernism? We've jumped that bit. Anyway, that's a part.
Or
but I'm
destroyed
saying, yeah. Well, now what I'm trying to say is that this the most linear aspect of Western art history and of a museum like MoMA would be the avant-garde. And I think that needs to be dislodged, or it needs to be put into some degree of disarray through other tropes. So that's one thing I wanted to
So I was going to ask you, I mean, there's so many questions, and I know people probably have a ton out there too, so I want to make sure, how are we doing up here? Okay. I mean, there are many tropes. One of my questions was, what are the other criteria than the avant-garde?
No, I want to retain the avant-garde. I just want to mess with it. I'm very attached to the term avant-garde.
So how do you mess with it?
It's just the terms on which the avant-garde is proposed. Let's say the terms on which the October art historians
And
propose
how
this.
would you describe that?
Well, there is a certain kind of, purist. Well, they changed one part of the paradigm by saying that the Soviet avant-garde is not the only avant-garde, that there have been avant-gardes afterwards, but then they restricted it to the American avant-garde, and very definitely the 60s avant-garde. Now, the arguments that are put forward in that are really actually quite challenging. And also in the book 1900, the way the art history is told has a perfect logic. And I'm very, very admiring of that logic, because that logic is important for us to be able to take alternate positions. It's almost the most extraordinary narrative.
So it would be
So
interesting to compare that book to Oquist Shah.
Well, I said that in my
Yeah.
writing also, in
Yeah.
my talk, that I would
That's
want
a
to know that.
class.
Sure.
That I would want to actually put those two
Yeah.
together. So,
That's a good CMAP research. No, I totally understand that. Other ideas about other criteria? I think that was also the name of a book.
other criteria.
Yes.
Steinberg.
I mean, I'll just rehearse briefly what I talked about earlier today, because in the course of my own research on Wojtysica, for example, I was very aware that Wojtysica was making what he understood to be interventions within an avant-garde. I mean, he explicitly understands the avant-garde as a kind of constellation. He understands it totally non-problematically as transnational. I mean, this is not even an issue for him. But in plotting that in my own research, I felt that one of the problems with a kind of constellation mode of the avant-garde is that it doesn't make visible the power operations that pertain to the links. So what links become visible, what points of utterance become visible or not, and that has led me to this question of topology, which Luis Perez Ramas very beautifully presented on also today. Topology as really following on the kinds of artistic experiments that the Brazilian modernists were making, or people like Wojtysica and Clark Tarsila at that time. Although actually Tarsila is fully topological. In any case, so what I'm trying to say here is that rather than think of a model in which we have this kind of endlessly expanding field in which we just try and represent more places. I mean, I think all modernism, much of modernism was a fight against representation and towards embodiment and enactment. And so thinking of that field rather than a kind of closed system or an endlessly expanding territory, but as a kind of unstable topological thing that gets deformed when we start to take into account different historiographic interventions, different artistic interventions, that I think is perhaps more accurate to the way practice actually happens and the way a kind of historiography can happen when we start to think not in terms of just kind of loose morphological confluences, but actual relations of intervention and connection, as Chika mentioned earlier, are not alien to the DNA of this museum either. That the DNA of this museum has a kind of transnational history to it.
And it also has actually a layered history. I mean, Alfred Barr was not William Rubin. And people sometimes forget that, you know. So I think actually, you know, we have a fairly good foundation to rethink what the last, you know, 40 years have meant. And I just, before we turn over to the, our very attentive audience, what struck me listening to you all today and tonight is that while what you suggest is very demanding, and I would also posit exhilarating for the staff, what about the audience? What are the interpretive strategies? I mean, that's what we're here for. I mean, I'd like to think we're here for the pleasure of what we do, but actually we're here for an audience, which is quite international and quite local, which, yes, is educated, but I think by and large quite not steeped in what we've been talking about. I actually think what the sort of perhaps slightly monochromatic history that we tell now is confusing enough. You know, yes, the research we do says people are quite satisfied, but what do they take away? I'm not sure. And I know people are still quite exercised by abstraction. I mean, so if you were, you know, somebody, and I think part of the problem goes back to, you know, we have education and we have curatorial. And in my humble opinion, they need to, yeah, they need to actually be more integrated. But if you were going to help develop a new interpretive strategy, how would you begin? What would it look like?
Is this great idea Documenta 14 propose? They call it unlearning, not to take a position that we know better, that we have a knowledge and we have to deliver the knowledge, but that it's something which is developed together. That's what is a theory they propose. Of course, I didn't participate.
They didn't propose it so much for the one-time visitor. They proposed it for the community in which the exhibition
yes,
took
the
place.
community, but also the way how they designed the exhibition, that from very basic things that they make impossible to visit the exhibition in a normal sort of a mode, that first you read the label and then look at the work. They, I guess, in purpose did other way around, that first you have an experience, then you go to the label, which is a very, like, of course you can discuss whether that's a good strategy for the museum, but and it's quite a banal thing to do, but I guess it was a very meaningful for them, that we are not starting from a discursive knowledge, which make the differences in between us, curators and the audience, and so on. So that was sort of a basic gesture to introduce unlearning as a practice of looking at the exhibition. So let's see whether they are successful or not. Probably they are successful in a long-term working with the local community. Let's see whether they are successful in the international public, which is a part of museum experience. But
they seem to be having trouble with Athens.
Yes and no. Yeah, they also exposing the conflict, which is another good advice. I mean, what is the problem? And what we are also talking a lot today about the question of the modern canon, that is a lot about dividing, and that this is the problem for the all educational programs. So you can also combine curatorial and education strategies, and which is even in the institutional, from the institutional point of view, not very difficult to introduce.
So the interpretive strategy wouldn't necessarily be where you start the story?
In a utopian sense, yes.
Geeta, what would you?
I don't know enough about museums.
Do it as your fantasy museum.
Really, I can't answer that.
Okay.
I mean, I would just. This is. I mean, we're not the MoMA curators, so that's a little hard.
But you are educators.
Yes, we're educators. I mean, I think that the most important thing would be to suggest to an audience, suggest to ourselves that we let go of something like the idea of a complete satisfaction of a narrative. I mean, a lot of people want to come to MoMA for the sense that they saw everything. They saw it from the beginning, up through the end, and that's a high ticket value, I suppose, for people. But I don't think that the success of the museum depends on always satisfying a full and complete narrative. I mean, I think that there are.
How do you communicate that, though?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's very important is to, right now, as the collections are configured, there is a sense that you could go through those permanent collections, and there you get your canon, and then you go on to see, some special exhibitions, which are involved in different ways. And I think that, there has to be ways of communicating a kind of mapping strategy. I don't think it's enough to say, okay, well, we'll change from a root to a rhizome if the rhizome isn't made available phenomenologically, as Geeta was describing it earlier. So making the curatorial mapping visible, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And right now, what's visible is the unspoken notion of a master narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
That's also my experience from the museum. You can offer to your audience quite complex projects, experimental, but you have to explain why you are doing this. And it can be one sentence. And if they are invited to go to your way of thinking, they are really able to accept whatever. They don't have that. This is our notion, what is experimental. They usually don't have that at all. And they are much more open than we suspect. So
I think people actually resist an idea that there is only one truth, because their lives are more complicated than that. Deep down.
I think part of the question is whether you curate expectations, right? Which is key, right? Curating expectations. When the curator implies or imagines that no, this will not work, right? This is what will work, and you try to sell that thing. Then what then happens is that your audience comes in expecting that thing that you are promising, right, to present. When and this is really the point about the curatorial and the educational, because my little understanding of these different realms, that the educational people are thinking more in terms of their audience, their primary audience. How do we present what we do, what the curators do? How do we present that to the audience, right? How do we manage their expectations? But that's something that tends to be the problem of the educators. So they are talking to, doing surveys and all of that. The curators are not doing that, I would think, or maybe not.
I think that was true. I think it's less and less true. I mean, I think actually curators want people to read their catalogs and look at their shows, I mean, it's again not, I think these generational shifts are serious. But,
Yes.
But I think you're not wrong.
You asked me this question, and I couldn't answer it in vis-a-vis the museum, because I don't have sufficient knowledge of the protocol of museums. But I'm going to bring in the complementary example of biennales. Now, I think that museum people have total contempt of biennales, and they feel that they have actually, ruined the art historical narrative.
We
And
spend a lot of time going to them,
I know,
however.
everybody's running everywhere, but so, and also they correctly critique, and I would be part of that critiquing contingent of the global contemporary as now an accepted category, the global contemporary. I think that needs to be badly deconstructed. So that apart, with that qualification, I would say that the best examples within Biennale curating could be actually not scoffed at because they are, in some sense transient, they are experimental, they are also seductive, that in fact some of that could be seen as having configured contemporary art, and now often also inputs where there's a repositioning of immediate or even further art historical examples, but let us say just the contemporary. And many of your exhibitions would be very contemporary in many ways, leaving aside the very important and for which one has great regard, the monographic exhibitions, which is a different phenomenon. But when there is some kind of a curatorial thematic, I think that some of the very, very innovative things have been done in biennales, plus the educative element, the educational element. Paulo Herkenhoff's Biennale was known for that in 98.
Singularly.
Known for that. And if I may say so, an experiment that is being done or an effort that is being made now in India at the Kochi Biennale is extraordinary in the way that the audience has been inducted into the experience, not with any kind of patronizing desire to educate them in modern art, but simply experientially, phenomenologically. And the Kochi Biennale directors, curators call it, and I'm moved beyond words on this, they call it a people's biennale. Now this is, first of all, it's a left government in Kerala, and these curators themselves, the directors, are very aligned to that. So of course this terminology comes from the left. But it is important that it comes from the left and that they're able to state it rhetorically and truly. So it's a rhetorical statement, but it is followed up by immense effort to galvanize, to completely reorient the idea of the audience for contemporary art. And it's a huge effort. But so why would museums find it so difficult?